Of the many executions ordered by King Henry VIII, the most horrific was undoubtedly that of Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury. Margaret was everything King Henry VIII feared the most. As the last Plantagenet, she was more royal than he was. Henry feared that she might become a dangerous threat to the Tudor dynasty, hence she was hacked to pieces at the age of 67 by an inexperienced rash executioner on the guillotine. Margaret Plantagenet was born during one of the most flammable periods in the history of the English royal family. The daughter of George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence, brother to Edward IV, and a leading figure in the Wars of the Roses and Isabella Neville. Margaret was destined for a future of privilege and power. She was born a princess in the Plantagenet royal house. This meant not only that Margaret came from a royal family, but also she came from the family that was historically opposed to the reign of the Tudors. She never imagined that her Plantagenet blood would cause so many unfortunate events that would change her life. In 1478, her father George Plantagenet was executed by her uncle, the king, on the basis of treason. By the age of 5, Margaret had both of her parents deceased, and her future was unknown. What would become of this young princess? Margaret and her brother Edward, Earl of Warwick, were sent to Sheen Palace and were raised alongside the children of King Edward IV. This settlement was dissolved in 1483 when King Edward died and took over. But he did not appoint Margaret's brother as heir. Instead, he kept a close eye on him, knowing he had legitimate claim to the throne. The situation was altered again in 1485, when Henry Tudor defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth and took the throne for himself. Henry now founded a whole new dynasty and was the first Tudor monarch to have sat on the throne. Margaret must have been uncomfortable with the situation. She and her brother Edward were next in line to the throne by virtue of their York blood, of which the new Tudor king was fully aware. The young Edward of Warwick, Margaret's younger brother, posed a great dangerous threat to the Tudor dynasty. He was hastily arrested and held under house arrest in the Tower of London, where he remained for almost 15 years before his execution on charges of plotting treason with the pretender, Perkin Warbeck. Before being imprisoned in the Tower of London. His claim to the throne made him too dangerous to live freely in society, so the new Tudor king had no choice but to imprison the young aristocrat. Henry arranged a series of cunning marriages for the daughters of previous kings and Margaret. Princesses of the House of York married allies that Henry knew he could trust, and made sure that princesses would only marry men who might not pose a threat to Henry's throne. Margaret was paired with Sir Richard Pole, the king's cousin. Sir Richard served Henry VII well and held high positions at court and in Wales. Margaret and Richard had 5 children. Unfortunately, Richard passed away in 1505. Things quite improved for Margaret when Henry VIII inherited the throne in 1509. Despite his fear of royal blood, Henry considered her loyal and called her the holiest woman in England. She was employed into the service of Catherine of Aragon, king's wife, and served as governess to Catherine's daughter, the Princess Mary. She was also Mary's godmother. In 1512 she was given back the title Countess of Salisbury in her own right, restoring the title that had previously belonged to her family. This restoration helped Margaret greatly and provided her income from her lands and estates in Salisbury, eventually leading to her becoming one of the wealthiest peers in England. Things became complicated for Margaret when Henry VIII decided to annul his marriage to Catherine. Margaret remained loyal to the Queen and showed much kindness to the Princess Mary. For a while Margaret got along with Henry VIII, but things became more dangerous for Margaret in 1536 when her son Reginald Pole rebelled against the king's new policies. Margaret and her son Reginald were both staunch Roman Catholics. In the 1530s, following the Reformation in England, Reginald fled abroad. He refused to recognize Henry as the supreme head of the new Church of England and staunchly disagreed with his break from the Catholic Church and the Pope. He wrote a book, Pro Ecclesiastici Unitatis Defension, in which he denounced the king's policies and explained exactly what he thought of the king's marriage to Anne Boleyn. The king was deeply offended and enraged. The king decided it was time for him to be out of the picture. This left Margaret in a difficult position. Was she to support her son or her sovereign lord? Margaret did her best to avoid the king questioning her loyalty and spoke out against her son's book. She wrote him a letter condemning his actions and saying that she wished she'd never given birth to such a traitor. In 1536 Reginald urged the princes of Europe to overthrow Henry immediately. The English king was enraged. At that particular time Reginald was out of reach, his anger was directed at his family members. In 1538, Margaret's son, Geoffrey, was sent to the Tower for aiding his exiled brother, Reginald. Later that year, Henry Pole was arrested along with his cousin, the Marquis of Exeter. Both men were executed for treason. There was eventually a roundup of other family members, and even the children of the family were sent to prison in the Tower. Margaret survived the tumultuous years of the Wars of the Roses and later stood by her mistress Queen Catherine of Aragon. This time around she was unable to survive this attack on her family. Henry feared that she would become the focus of a revolt, and in March 1539, Margaret Pole was sent to the Tower. Margaret was not given the opportunity to defend herself, and in May 1539, an Act of Attainder was passed against her for aiding her sons. The conviction meant Margaret would be stripped of her titles and lands, but even then the king did not send her to the scaffold. Maybe he thought that because of her age, she would die soon enough. It wasn't like that. Margaret Pole spent 2 long years in her cold cell in the Tower of London. Few weeks down the line, a rebellion in Yorkshire against Henry's rule reignited his anger and sealed Margaret's fate. Although she had nothing to do with this rebellion, he decided to see her as a threat and ordered her execution. We can't imagine how this unfortunate old woman was feeling at that moment. Her mental state was a mixture of uncertainty and anxiety for the well-being of her family and her own death. On the morning of the 27th of May 1541, the constable of the Tower informed Margaret that she was to die that day. She responded that she had committed no crime, but neither her words nor her old age could save her now. Henry VIII was determined to get rid of anyone who might pose a threat to his throne, which included an infirm 67-year-old lady. Until the end, Margaret claimed her innocence before God. She stated no crime had been imputed to her and that she was wrongly judged. According to popular belief, a poem was found carved on the wall of her cell that gave more evidence that Margaret was wrongly charged. She was given a short time to prepare herself and was then led out to the Tower, where she was met by the Lord Mayor of London and other witnesses. Contrary to the story that has been popularized through the centuries that Margaret had to be physically held down during her execution, and once the first blow of the axe missed her neck, she jumped from the gallows and started running about the scaffold with the headsman chasing her, axe raised above his head. But this is simply not true. This story seems quite far-fetched. However, Margaret laid her head on the block and awaited her end. Her brutal end was not of her own fault, but that of an inexperienced executioner. He hacked at her head, neck and shoulders until eventually she was gone. The execution was obviously a bloody event with an undoubtedly sad and tragic end for the old woman. Her tragic death shocked the Tudor court, but Henry showed no remorse. She was buried in St. Peter's Church in the Tower of London, rather than the magnificent grave she built for herself at Christ Church Abbey in Dorset.